Hi friends, Valerie here again, the Foodie Medic, here to help you with a recipe for a healthy life. And today I want to talk about apples and pears. These actually came from a friend's tree. Even though I have apple trees, it was some friends who had trees just loaded and no use for all of those. And like I've mentioned before in other videos, if you have friends or you know of someone who's got a tree full of fruit that they can't use all of it, strike a deal with them, share. If you have a tree, share with your friends. One tree that produces well can feed the neighborhood. So apples, these are, I don't know what the variety is. It's probably an old variety. They're kind of a softer apple. They're nice and tart. They actually remind me a lot of the trees from my childhood. We've already eaten a lot of them fresh. We had this many and then some again. And I made pie, which actually I noticed when I made the pie, they were a little bit crumbly and they softened quickly and actually kind of degraded a bit, which the pie was still tasty, but it's not the ideal apple for a pie, but it is perfect for a sauce. The pears were actually not ripe yet, but now in sitting and waiting, some of them have ripened up nicely. I just ate one, so good, really juicy. As you can see, I have a lot of them, and I don't want to give up this much storage space in my fridge to keep them once they do become ripe. So I'm going to pick through them, find the ripest ones, and go ahead and include them with the apples because I'm going to make applesauce. And I want to show you how truly easy applesauce is. You should never have to go to the store and buy canned or packaged applesauce again if you have access to fresh apples. Even if you don't have access from a tree, if you buy from the grocery store, nothing wrong with that, but say you buy a bag of apples on sale. What are the chances, unless you have a bunch of voracious apple eaters in your household, that you're going to get through that whole bag of apples before they start kind of going soft and bad? Consider this. If you're going to buy apples from the store and you're going to buy them in bulk, why not take half of them, make some sauce, put it aside in whatever manner you like to keep it, freezer, canning, what have you, whatever's appropriate for you. And then you've got some fresh later, you've got some available for making applesauce cake, you name it. So something to think about. Part of my goal is to help people incorporate more fruits and vegetables into their life on a daily basis, plus eliminating waste and packaging and going back to a little bit of the old ways of making your own food rather than buying it already prepared for it, where you control the ingredient list and you get the most nutrition out of it without a bunch of packaging and spending a lot of money. Applesauce, truly easy and very tasty. So what I'm going to do, that I'm not going to waste your time with here, is I'm going to go through these, pick through them, make sure there's none that have bad going south. If they're over the top, they're going to go out the door. I used to have chickens and a lot of animals, and automatically these would go for the bunnies, the pigs, the chickens. They all loved them. I'm going to pick off this type of stuff, the woody stems, the leaves, anything that is inedible. I'm going to wash them up, and I'm going to leave the peels on. And I think for today, I'm also going to go ahead, cut them in half and core them, or if you have like one of those little apple cores, but I'm going to take the core out. You actually don't have to when you're making applesauce because that stuff you can separate out later, but I'm going to go from the pot right to my blender, so I'm going to save myself the trouble of getting that stuff out later. I'm going to go ahead and core these now. As far as the pears, like I mentioned, I'm going to go through, I'm going to pick the ripest ones, the really beautiful big ripe ones I'm going to save for maybe poaching for dessert later, but the kind of little oddballs that are funny colored and funny shaped, and by the way, they don't have to look perfect. They don't have to look grocery store perfect to be great pieces of fruit. For the most part, a lot of this stuff you see on the outside of apples and pears, and especially pears, it doesn't really affect the fruit on the inside. It's all in how it looks. But the grocery store wants to put out the most beautiful, most perfect one with no spots. like this, where this guy probably never make it to the display, but yet it's a perfectly good piece of fruit. So I'm going to do those things and then I'll be back. Okay, I'm back. So what I did was I washed the apples, like I said. I trimmed them up. Any spots on the skin that look really objectionable, I cut off. And you'll notice that I left the peels on, both the pears and the apples. And there's a reason for that. You don't have to, but to me, it adds flavor, it adds color. There's natural pectin in here, which will help you end up with a thicker product rather than having to boil all the moisture out of it. The natural pectin will start to help it gel and set up a little bit, as well as just whatever natural vitamins and nutrients that are in the peels. I don't want to lose them. Now the peels will cook slower than the apples themselves, so it's a little bit of a mixed cooking process, and that you're going to have to cook it a little longer than you would think, just to break down those skins. But the trick is that I plan on running this through the blender in the end. If I was just going to say smash it down for a chunkier version, and if I personally found the skins objectionable, you can always run it through a colander and smoosh all the soft pulp through and leave the skins behind. So this is a personal choice. If I can take those skins and grind them up effectively enough in the blender to where if my grandkids are eating it, they're not finding little chewy bits of skin peel, then that's better. To me, that's better because I've added value here, added nutrition. So I got a nice mixture of apples to pears. I actually am about 3/4 apples, only 1/4 pears. One is because that's what I have, but also here again, it's personal choice. I think that pears tend to have a little grainier texture and even down in the sauce, and so I just prefer to keep it more on the apple side. So a little pear in there for just a little bit of pear flavor and just, using up my fruit. So that's just a choice. Also, I only have one type of apple here, but if you have multiple type of apples, it's great to mix and match, because each different type of apple will give your sauce just a little bit different color, flavor, texture. Like if you do soft yellow, those summer apples, Yellow Delicious, they make a very fine, light colored, light tasting applesauce. Where if you use like a darker red, and especially a hard, crisp apple that has a lot of tooth to it, you'll end up with this more reddish colored applesauce that's a little more earthy and robust. And some of those I like to just smash rather than grind up fine and leave chunky. And that's something kind of going back from my childhood and what Grandma used to make, and great for applesauce cake and putting over pancakes or what have you. So depends on your personal taste, what your audience is, and what you're after, or make more than one kind. It's fun. So while I was cutting them, as soon as I got them cleaned and trimmed and what have you, while they're waiting to go into the pot, I put them into a bowl of salt water. And that's what my mom and grandma always did and taught me to do to keep them from yellowing. You can also use a commercial, like a fruit fresh type of product that is citric acid that keeps the flesh from turning brown. So I drained off that salt water, put them in the pot, and now I just have about this much water in the bottom of the pot. You could put more if you want, but it's going to make for a watery product that you're probably eventually going to have to want to boil all that out of anyway. And believe me, they break down pretty quick and start releasing their juices. So I just want enough water in the bottom to get the cooking process started without scorching the apples on the bottom. I don't want to really fill it up with a bunch of water. I also add just a wee bit of kosher salt, because anytime you add a little bit of salt to a sweeter type thing, it helps enhance the sweetness. And now I'm going to help keep the browning from happening, I'm going to add some lemon. And this actually is a Myers lemon, and this is an organic lemon. So if you don't have organic anything, like even your apples, if you were using store-bought that aren't organic, you really need to wash them well, because there's a lot of pesticides that can be used in the fruit industry. Same thing goes with the citrus. So even though this is an organic one, I still washed it anyway, because it's been hanging out in the store. People have handled it, what have you. So I washed and dried it. I'm just kind of wanting to do this for a little extra kick of flavor, so I'm going to zest it with my microplaner here. And did I say this is a Myers lemon? So this is not going to be necessarily as acidic and tart. This is going to be a little more sweet, pretty fragrant, and add a lot of flavor to it. And speaking of flavor, I'm going to flavor this with whatever else I'm going to use, and if I decide to sweeten it at all, I'm going to do that later. Right now I'm just going to cook it down. I'm going to find out what the base fruit taste is before I start embellishing it with anything else. Okay. Give this a cut. So I'm going to start with just the juice of one. If at some point down the road I feel like it would benefit from a little more, then I'll consider doing another one. Or lime or orange. You can get a little inventive. Okay. So let me give this a quick little toss. I've already turned the heat on. I'm going to watch this pretty close. You don't have to hover, but just know that if you go too rambunctious with the heat and start getting it boiling too quick and leave it unattended for too terribly long, you can start scorching the bottom of the pan. And ask me how I know this, but if you ever burn the bottom of your applesauce, even if you take the other stuff out and you clean the pan, you start over, that burn flavor's in there. You end up having to start completely over. I don't want to do that. I don't want to waste all this. So I'm going to kind of do this on a bit of a gentle heat, and I'm just going to monitor it every so often. Notice it was a heavy, I'm using a Dutch oven. You use a big stock pot. Just make sure it's big enough to accommodate all your fruit, some fluid, some stirring without slopping it all over the stove. The heavier the pan, it kind of slows down that potential for scorching. So that's why I chose my Dutch oven. So at this point, I'm just kind of in the wait and occasionally check and stir, and we'll go from there. Okay, I'm back. And the sauce is broken down nicely. The apples and the pears are broken down nicely. But as you can see, the skins are still pretty intact, or the peels are pretty intact. So I don't want to overcook the pulp. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead, and I've got a spider here. I'm going to fish out my chunkiest parts and put into my blender. Now you can see I've got a pretty high-powered blender, although this is soft enough and cooked enough that most any blender should be able to handle it. You could use an immersion blender in here, but quite frankly, I don't know that it would chop up the skins fine enough. So I'm going to fish out all the chunky stuff and give it a buzz, and then make an evaluation before I add it back in if I'm happy that it's sufficiently ground down. If I'm not happy and I find that there's a lot of little flakes in it that are going to get into cotton teeth and be unpleasant, then I'm going to say, skip it. Maybe strain out through a larger mesh strainer and get as much of the juice and the pulp as possible, and then leave the peels behind. So I'll give this a whir, and then we'll take a look. Okay, I was happy with how it came out. It came out really super fine, textured, almost like baby food. However, the stuff that I have still in the pan here has a little bit more texture, some really fine chunks to it, because I don't want it to all be super fine. But that looks really good. I don't see any big bits of peel in there. So I'm going to add that back. I'm going to cook this just a little bit longer because of the different ripeness. of the fruits and the two different varieties, pears and apples, it all didn't cook at the same rate. There was some that was still not 100% broken down. So, but this is the point where I'm going to watch it pretty close now and make sure I don't scorch this. Giving it a stir every now and again. I tasted it. It's good, but it's really tart. So I am going to sweeten it. And cinnamon, perfect in applesauce. So I'm going to go ahead and add cinnamon at this point. You could get adventurous and try different flavors if you like I mentioned, different citrus juices. You could try different herbs. I would recommend though, if you're going to do that, pull a little out in a separate bowl, put in a tiny little bit of the herb you think you want to try, mix it in, give it a sample, give it a taste, see what you think. You might think that mint sounds really good in there, but you might find you don't actually like it. So I do a sample on the side before I commit this entire pot to a flavor. But for me, cinnamon's a no-brainer. So I'm going to add this, and I'm going to be fairly liberal with the cinnamon. Give it a stir and see what I think. So now I have to decide what I'm going to use for sweetener. Now my whole point of being the foodie medic and looking for recipes for a healthy life is the reduction or the elimination of refined sugar. Fine, if you use it, it's up to you. I'm not going to get into the big debate about whether it's helpful or harmful for you. However, I've read enough stuff that, in my personal opinion, the least amount possible is better. So, I have some options. I could go with something that's still fairly sweet but a little more natural, like honey. I could go with like natural maple syrup. The honey will tend to darken a little bit, as will the maple, and the maple will bring its distinct maple flavor. And the honey actually will flavor it in its distinct way as well. I think I'm going to go with something that's a little more less calorie, less glycemic index. And so I have options of stevia or monk fruit, or I also use xylitol sometimes, which is made from I think the lining of a tree bark or something along those lines. But those don't add the caloric intake as well as the bump your blood sugar way up. A lot better for you metabolism-wise. I'm kind of thinking today I'll go with monk fruit. It's pretty sweet. It's kind of a little bit fruity. So I'm going to start with a little bit of it, taste it, see how I like it. So let me find that and get that going. Okay, I made my decisions and I made my additions. I decided to stick with pretty classic. I did cinnamon. I used monk fruit and stevia as a combination. And then just for a little hint of some extra floral notes, I did go ahead and add some honey. So what I started out with, a really pale yellow applesauce, did turn a little more of the darker amber color because of the cinnamon and because of the honey. I found that it does make it a little bit darker, but it's beautiful. It's applesaucey, nice texture. This is a pretty fine textured one. Like I mentioned, sometimes I do it chunkier for different applications, especially like if you're going to serve it alongside meat or something along those lines. So now that's still nice and hot. I'm going to let this cool down and then decide how you're going to keep this. Now, I made 3/4 of my Dutch oven here. This is clearly more than 2 people are going to eat in the next few days. So then I decide, how am I going to keep this? I'm a canner, so I'd actually have no problem going ahead and processing these up in some little pint jars or even half pints, whatever I think 2 people can reasonably use without having it hang out in the refrigerator for a long time. But I'm also a really big fan of my vacuum sealer. So once this is all cold, I probably will portion it out into small little envelopes for the freezer of vacuum sealed containers, and be sure to label them, because sometimes in the freezer sauce and sauce and sauce can all look real similar. So I label them with the date and what it is, They stack up nice if you let them freeze flat, and then you can stack them nice in containers, or keep a separate container just for applesauce, just for tomato sauce, or what have you. Especially if you have a big deep freeze, that's really great. And so all winter long, we'll have applesauce for any time we like. I mentioned one of my favorite things to do when I was a little girl was to put applesauce over pancakes in the morning. Yummy. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for joining me, and hope to see you soon. Bye.